Thank you for joining us for this second forum Health and Medicine has put together in the last year, looking at the inextricable links between health and education. I view the forum we had last year as having laid the groundwork and begun the discussion to help us understand the basic fundamentals of how we pay or don't pay for public education in Illinois, what the consequences of these political and funding decisions are, who are the advantaged, who are the disadvantaged, and how are health and education linked. I'm pleased that we were able to plan this second forum in the series to delve deeper into these issues with you, to think more about the political climate we're in today, how the public policy decisions we make, the budgets that we develop, the schools that we keep open and those that we close, impact the quality of education that children receive, and how those decisions not only impact the quality of education, but are direct determinants of equity or inequity in opportunity, community resilience, and how they determine health outcomes, health status, and the ability to have upward mobility in our society. We've grappled here at Health and Medicine with questions of addressing structural and societal inequities in education, funding, segregation, poverty, health, and so much more. We work to inform ourselves with the facts, dream about what might be possible, and then gather partners like all of you to learn and think with us about what it will take to create a much more just society. I thank each of you for joining with us today to learn and dream. As Daniel Burnham said, we shall make no small plans. Thank you for doing this with us. This forum is part of the Health and Medicine Health Justice Forum series. We hold forums like this every couple of months, forums that bring together experts and people working in the many arenas touched by health reform and health in Illinois. I want to publicly thank the Chicago Community Trust for their financial support for this series of discussions. And I want to particularly thank Tiffany Ford and Wesley Eplin, staff at Health and Medicine, for being the Health and Medicine Forum gurus and meticulously and brilliantly planning this forum series. So thank you, Wesley and Tiffany. By being here today, you are now on our mailing list, and you will hear from us about future forums and other materials, other forums, discussions, papers that we put out at Health and Medicine. How many of you have never been to a Health and Medicine event? Wow, welcome. Thank you. I want to orient you for just a moment, particularly those of you who are new to Health and Medicine. So here's what we're about in a 2-minute thumbnail elevator speech, I guess. Founded by the indefatigable Quentin Young in 1981, we've worked as an independent health policy research and advocacy group that works to promote social and racial justice and challenge inequities in health and health care. We view health and public health very, very broadly and always make sure we look through a lens of equity that includes the many influences on health that are not the things that happen in the doctor's office, though important, but are the ability to earn a decent wage, have our children educated in decent schools, have support services for people to live in their homes and communities, access to transportation that can get us where we need to go, feel safe in our homes and neighborhoods. Those are just some of the ways that we look at health and public health. We work to develop policies that impact health systems to improve the health of all people in Illinois. We try to identify gaps where our policy expertise, our skills, and the lens we look through can move our systems to be more just. We've had a lot of success, and we've had many challenges, and we have lots more challenges, as we all know, looking to the next several years. Specifically, our work focuses on strengthening the healthcare safety net, helping to ensure that health reform planning and implementation in Illinois are best designed to meet the real needs of patients and families, that systems are accountable for meeting those needs. We work to reform our long-term care system in Illinois so it supports older adults and people with disabilities to remain in their homes and communities rather than living in institutions, as so often happens in Illinois. We work to reform our health and mental health services and policies for youth involved in the criminal justice system. We address adverse childhood experiences and traumatic experiences in childhood to address those so they don't carry with people throughout their lives and impact their health and well-being later. We work to develop a robust healthcare workforce that allows workers to practice to their full capability and is reflective of the communities they serve. So that's my little thumbnail. You can find much more on our website, and I hope you'll take a look. I look forward to learning together and working together today to create solutions to very intractable problems facing our education system in Chicago. We've designed this program so there will be a lot of time to ask questions and to work together in roundtable discussions later. Thank you, Tiffany, for pushing us to have more time to work together. And we hope that together we can develop some solutions. We will hear from speakers this morning that'll set the groundwork for the discussions we'll enter into later this afternoon. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce my colleague and Health and Medicine Board member, Linda Murray, who will provide us with some historical context and introduce our keynote speakers. So thanks again for being here.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Margie. Here we go. Well, I want to try to get us a little bit back on time. And I think it might be useful for us to start off, why is Health and Medicine doing this kind of forum? Margie explained to you that this is our second forum in this area, but really, there are two reasons why. First, in health and medicine, some people, not everybody, but some people, and I'm one of them, we think everything is health. So it's okay if you don't think that, but we think everything is health, so it makes sense to us. But the second reason is that there is no question that this issue of education goes to the heart of being healthy. Not in the normal ways that we think about, which are important. So we know people with more formal education have better health outcomes. All of those things are important. But it has to do with why this issue is central to everything we do in health and medicine. And I would argue, if I could fix one system, if I could fix one thing in the world, it would be education. Education, in my mind, is central because you need education to defend democracy. And if we understand the history of education, which we don't have time to discuss fully today, that becomes more and more obvious. We are focused today on K through 12 at this forum, and we're going to be talking about some of the issues that are presented with this most fundamental piece of our education system. But let me just start off by saying that every group that I know, and certainly African Americans, certainly black people in this country, think education is critically important. Most immigrant groups, as they come in, feel that education is important. In the United States and in most cultures, real education begins usually, historically speaking, in the family and in the church. And one of the roles of education in every culture is control. I'm not interested in that, okay? But that's one of the functions of education. In the United States, as a relatively backwards colony, formal education was really a privilege of the wealthy and the rich. And while in the northeastern part of the country, in 1700, 1800s, early 1800s, there were some efforts to have some more public, what we call today public schools, throughout the South, certainly where most African Americans were living. Education for the masses was really almost unheard of. If you were lucky, you might become literate by reading the Bible. But in general, education was considered something that only the rich, only the people that were going to run things needed to have. So there's a lesson for us then. Okay, only if you were about the business of running things. So if you're trying to run your life and you're not educated, you're in trouble. So public education in the United States and why it's so critically tied to movements for social justice comes in large measure, not completely, but in large measure, from the emancipation of slaves. And as the slaves were emancipated throughout the South, they clearly understood that in order to secure their freedom, they needed education. And it's then, during Reconstruction, during the Republican, as in Abraham Lincoln Republican, the Republican governments of the South during Reconstruction, you see for the first time public funding with public tax money of K through 12 education. And there is a debate. It occurred within our community, and it's occurring today. A debate on what is the role of the education system. Is the role of the education system to control people and to train them, to give them a clear set of skills? So those of you that pay thousands of dollars to go to universities and they tell you all the competency skills you're going to learn, be very careful and suspicious about that. Okay. All right. Is the role of education to train people to go and do jobs that the people that run things want you to do? That was really the debate during Reconstruction. That's really the fundamental debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Is the goal for former slaves to go and learn how to wait a table, okay, or be a tailor, or expand skills that slaves already had in terms of construction and bricklaying and ironworks? Or was the role of education to make sure that former slaves were never again enslaved? And that debate is exactly what's going on today in our city and around the country. Do we really need people who can code a computer? Or do we need people who can tell the difference between fake news and real news and consider public policy debates? Are we interested in teaching and forcing our children and young people to be compliant? Or do we want them to be able to exercise their freedom and change the world in a way that they think makes sense? That's really the debate that's going on. So we're talking about today investing in Chicago schools, and we have to be honest and say that we never achieved a real public education system. Our education system is in better shape frequently than it is now in many places. But we never achieved that real dream of a true universal public education, people that allowed folks to gain the knowledge they needed to change and remake their world, which is what I believe the goal of education is. And too often today, we allow debates, we entertain notions that people don't need to go to college. We don't have to quibble about what kind of college looks like. We actually entertain the notion that all you have to do is learn these 5 skills for this job. You don't really need to learn about anything else. You don't know any history. You don't need to know any art. You don't need to know any literature. This is not education. And God forbid that you actually go to school and might learn how to change things. That's really dangerous. So the questions that we're going to talk about today have to do with how do we invest in structures that allow our population to ask the questions they need to ask and gain the information and knowledge they need to restructure the world the way they think it should be structured. So the notion that we have 25% of our population who correctly understood that their lives were worse than they used to be. I'm talking about the 25% of the adult population that voted for our president-elect. They understood, because they live and walk and breathe every day, that their jobs were not what they used to be, that they were unable to care for their families the way they used to. Not that what used to be was good enough, and then actually decide that Donald Trump is the answer to that. That's a lack of education right there. So actually, education has real impact on people. Not simply because most Chicago public schools don't have a library, that's a crime in and of itself, but because in fact, we don't teach young people how to think, how to question, how to challenge, how to resist authority, which after all is the primary function of youth. So we need to ask ourselves, how did we get in trouble? How did we get to this situation? And in what arenas can we change that? Public education as a public tax-supported system is one important arena, but there are others. In people's clubs and churches and basketball leagues and sewing circles, there are other places where education can and must go forward. We like to think in health and medicine that this forum is one such place, and that by coming here together, we can share our thoughts about how we educate each other and our colleagues and friends and neighbors to, in fact, save our children. Because one thing is abundantly clear. If we fail to educate our children, they suffer more, they die younger, and the nation continues to go backwards. We have two excellent speakers today. Our first speaker is a professor of educational policy studies and African American studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research interests include critical race theory, school and community relationships, youth culture, and the relationship between housing and public education. David has been working with youth and community groups. He's a son of our city, an activist. He serves as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Lawndale Little Village School of Social Justice. I always like hearing Dr. Dave Stovall because he is a brilliant thinker and scholar, and he challenges us in very real ways. And because, in fact, he lives on the South Side and he teaches in our schools, he has a real-world experience. I have to say that a few years ago, I was on a panel with him and introduced myself, and this is what he always reminds me what real education is. And I was introducing myself to him, and he said, "I know who you are." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he said, "You know, Marcus, my son, you know, I hang with Marcus." I said, "Oh, okay." Some of his friends are a little weird, but you know, he had a... And he said, "I hang with Marcus, and he was a critical part of my education." Now, I thought the boy was high. Now, I'm saying, like, what? He said, "He would bring me books. He would sneak books to me, my books. He would sneak books to me when we were in high school that I read. Buy books, put them in your house, let your rebellious teenagers sneak them out and educate themselves." Brother David Stovall.
Well, peace and greetings, everybody, and I want to thank the community here for even having me, because I'm a lot more used to being uninvited than invited. So after my comments, you will see why that usually happens. And I also want to thank folks in the medical professions, public health, and the medical sciences for actually putting this issue as an intersectional and interdisciplinary issue, because a lot of times, especially in the professoriate, folks get into these very benign disciplinary foci that doesn't allow us to see the world as it happens, right? And when we are not allowed to see the world as it happens, then we make these tragic mistakes. Now, one of the things that Dr. Murray said, and this is true story, me and Marcus were chemistry lab partners. And we were just not down with what was happening in chemistry class. And Marcus looked over to me, he was like, look, man, hell with this, read this. And we had these little stands where you could prop your books up. So the chemistry teacher thought that we were in it, right? That we were reading. I'm looking feverishly at the books. I'm like, yeah. And I'm, of course, giving him my high school rebellious, acting like I'm paying attention. And I'm looking, oh, this is great. Yeah. But what I'm actually reading is the collective speeches of Malcolm X. Right? And in class in particular, the one that sticks out the most is a speech called The Ballad of the Bullet. And it made me start to think about what, as my high schoolers now call it, so interesting how words revisit themselves. Like my high schools always talk about being woke, right? But they use it as an adjective, right? That's a really woke sweater you got on, those some woke shoes, right? Or in class they say, oh man, this is kind of woke, right? But this idea around thinking about education in a very particular way, I would encourage folks to read a book edited by a guy named Tom Tresser called Chicago is Not Broke, right? It's a critically important book because and it reminds me, so when I was invited to talk about what is the role of an equitably funded school in society, and here in Illinois and Chicago, we have to ask a certain set of questions. And I don't want to steal Ralph Matera's thunder because I truly appreciate his work, but it's something that he puts forward that I think becomes critically important. About 6 years ago, Jim Edgar, former governor of Illinois, was interviewed, and he talked about the budget woes. And he said, look, in the early 90s, I reminded folks that we hadn't been paying into pensions and other bills since the 70s. He said, that was 20 years ago. It's 20 years later. So the state of Illinois has decided not to pay its bills or into infrastructure for the last 40 years. So it's not about a state being broke. It's about a state being clear that they're not going to pay for certain things, right? Now that's interpreted as being broke. So this thing around really kind of thinking, and when we talk about education, these are the critical questions that we have to ask, and the answers are not always sanguine. They're not pretty. They're going to force us to think about things in a different way. So instead of thinking about being broke, what does it mean to say we're not going to pay because the folks who have the most affect are the most disposable? Now, I use very forward language around that because I don't want to run from it. You all in medicine and public health, you all say vulnerable populations. Let's kick that up. Disposable populations. What do you do to particular people when you deem them disposable? What does their education look like? What does their housing look like? What does their employment look like? What do their health outcomes look like? So now we have to ask a different set of questions. And when we ask those different set of questions, those answers pull us to a different set of understandings around how this doesn't become happenstance. Now, let me be clear. Bruce Rauner does not care about Chicago public schools. Let me say that publicly, right? In fact, Bruce Rauner has essentially said, look, y'all can go die, right? I don't care about this. In fact, I don't even have any aspirations beyond governor. I'll be a one-term governor. But what I'm going to do is, quote unquote, right this system, right? As a maverick, right? It's always interesting how when you get $1 billion, you can now consider yourself a revolutionary, right? So these things around thinking about this in particular ways is couched in a particular understanding as a native Chicagoan on how Chicago schools actually function. And then what have been the attempts to actually push back on the system and create viable spaces of education. Now, Dr. Murray put it out in the beginning. I think this is very important. And I think as parents, as concerned community members, as folks who are paying attention to this, we very rarely ask this question. And I'm always asking this question of my high schoolers all the way to my PhD students. What is the difference between education and school? Right? Not rhetorically, but in their physical form, their material form, right? Because we have to ask a larger historical question that the answer isn't pretty to, right? So we have to say that the U.S. schooling system was never intended to educate the populace, right? And when we come to grips with that, now we have to ask a question. If we understand that to be true, is school a place where education happens? Now, the answer that I've been getting historically is that education happens in schools not because of the system, but because with those disposable populations, it largely happens in spite of the system, right? Always a quick survey that I do in talks. Always ask folks, think about the teacher that you had that you consider to be a good teacher. Now, ask yourself, why was that teacher always in trouble? Right? Just think about it. They made a conscious decision that school was not important. They made a decision that your education was important, and they would risk their employment to get you educated over being schooled. Because school is about order and compliance, right? We are rewarded for order and compliance, right? That's what standardized testing is. That's what these strange benchmarks are that have very little to do with learning are. And we always think about these as being sanguine to education systems. No, they're order and compliance systems, right? We know from the Educational Testing Service, from the College Board, and American College Testing that tests test one thing: how well you take a test at a certain time of day. And in fact, when we talk about those disposable populations, think about the absurdity of some of the testing that we see in Chicago public schools. Now, give you all a hypothetical. We're all in the third grade classroom. We line up, we come into class for our test. It's the first year of our test. And they get us into our classrooms. And before we take the test, they give us these dry cookies. Right? And I'm always thinking about this, right? They give you these dry cookies, but they don't give you anything to drink. So you got the young folks, you got the babies taking tests, and you're choking them, right? And then we ask about performance. You say, well, what conditions are they even engaging in this assessment? And then you have schools that are on probation that in some instances can receive 66 to 100 assessments per week. So if I'm taking 66 to 100 tests per week, what learning is happening there? Absolutely nothing. And what I always try to do in these particular instances when I'm talking outside of educational spaces but across disciplines, I like to localize what's happening. And I think Loyola has a particular locale that we very rarely ask questions of because of its relationship in particular to housing and education. Right now, it is harder to get into a selective enrollment high school in Chicago than it is to become a freshman at Harvard, right? So now when we think about this particular space, we don't have to look far at other parts of the city. I like being here because all we have to do is look right up the street, right? Walter Payton is up the street, right? Now, no, and everybody, when we mention this, everybody thinks that we have acrimony towards the young folks who are in those spaces. That's not the case. What we're talking about is when we look at an equitable system, how do you have a space that has journalism classes, roving stock quotes, economic classes, classes on the human condition, and in the same city, funded in the same system, you have schools that don't have libraries? There are 120 plus schools in CPS, K-8, that do not have libraries. So now, when we ask, and again, I love the geography folks because they do GIS. GIS is a perfect thing because you can just see it, right? Said, let's just ask the question, where are the schools with no libraries? Right? Simple. And when we look it up, it looks like a beard, the south and west sides of the city, right? The only thing that blocks it from being a full beard is the lake, right? So now when we look at those places that don't have libraries, and now we need to take it a little deeper. Where are the places where housing is most unstable? Let's kick it up again. Where are the places where you have the largest concentrations of shootings and homicides? Now, in many spaces, in traditional research, we would start to acknowledge this and start to pull out pathologies, but that's not the case. I would argue that we should understand the dynamic I just described to you as state-sanctioned violence against disposable populations, right? So now, when we start to think about that in particular ways, we have these very sanguine examples. Now, as a Chicagoan, this always sticks out to me. Now, some of you all are familiar. There's a school, another school up the street. They don't even tell you it's a public school. It's called Ogden. Right? So Ogden is right here on the corner of Oak and about Wabash. Right? So it's like Ogden, Newberry Library, all the nice touristy stuff that you can get in Chicago in like your 3 minutes here. Right? But the thing to me about Ogden that always sticks out, I never knew that Ogden was a public school. Right? Ogden is only 20 years younger than the city of Chicago. Right? It was established in 1857. Right? And when you see it, it's this huge edifice. And coming downtown as a young person, I was like, oh yeah, that's just some other random private school. I didn't know it until one of my guys became the principal. I was like, oh yeah, man, I'm at Ogden. Like, oh, okay, I'm thinking, because there's an Ogden International High School that's right off Ogden and Racine. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. Ogden. He's like, no, Ogden over on Oak Street. I said, that's a public school? Right? That's bursting at the seams, right? So it's overcrowded, it's a fire hazard, and there's a brand new building up the street called Jenner. In fact, if you stand on the corner of Oak and Wabash, if you stand in the middle of the street, you can see Jenner, right? But Jenner is where a former public housing unit called Cabrini Green used to be. And the remaining residents who live in a couple of sets of subsidized and public housing still go to Jenner, but Jenner has been depopulated. So Jenner has about 200 students. Principal Cranston, who's doing an excellent job over there, talked to Mike Boyer, and they begin to say, all right, look, we can share resources because our schools are up the street. But because of the thinking about who populated one school, the parents at Ogden went crazy. And we see this all the time. So when Dr. Murray talks about control and possession, this thing around fundamental rights and who has access to them is always contested. So when we talk about an equitable funded system, and I think it's important to go back to history, and if folks are interested in this work, look at a proposal in the early 2000s by Miguel del Valle. And Miguel del Valle, as a state rep, actually put forward an equation around school equity. And he actually teamed up with downstate folks and said, look, we know that all the wealth is concentrated not just in the city of Chicago, but in Cook County and four collar counties, right? And when we look at those spaces, now we see the ingrained inequitable process that's engaged by way of property taxes. So now, where CPS collects this broad space of property taxes and then distributes them, hence the inequity, public school districts in those four collar counties and Cook County can decide, because they control the tax dollars, where that money goes to those particular schools. Now, Illinois has another problem. Illinois has 818 school districts. Now, the most populous state in the United States does not have 818 school districts. Now, in Illinois, we do this really strange thing where you'll have a school district that will be about 3 districts, and then you'll have a high school that will be its own district. Right? I'm always saying to myself, what was the decision made around that? And what was the idea around what is to be controlled in that space? And when we talk about this disdain, and DeValle was was revolutionary in his thinking around this. He said the disdain that folks have downstate is that Cook County in particular and the city of Chicago gets all the resources. We know that's not true. When we actually look at it, the resources are distributed in a very different way. So now, what would it mean to have an equitable distribution of those resources that were not property tax dependent? And it changes up the scope of how we look at education. Now, let's bring this back to Jenner and Ogden. Some of you all may have heard the story on WBEZ, and thanks to the folks who reported that out. But there's something that comes into this space, and I think as the public health community, as the medical community, as the medical sciences community, we cannot be dismissive of the realities of race, racism, and white supremacy in the United States. Right? I cannot talk to you about schools without talking about racism. I cannot talk to you about housing without talking about racism. I cannot talk about employment without talking about racism. Now, let me be clear. When I say white supremacy, I am not talking about a group of fools with hoods on, right? Because that's white extremism, right? That's an element of white supremacy, but not white supremacy in its form and function. When I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking about the assumed views and values of white, Western European descended, heterosexual Christian males as normal, right, and good. Everything else is othered. So now, when we start to think about that in terms of school processes, and you start to talk about vulnerable/disposable populations, what are the rights that are determined by certain populations that others have no right to? So now when we think about schools, there's this inevitable right, but the folks who live in the community that surrounds Jenner also pay taxes. The folks who live in Streeterville pay taxes and think they pay more, but actually don't, because poor folks pay more into tax systems proportionately. So now we know these things to be true, but yet the distribution of resources or the proximity to black bodies determines these inequitable health or inequitable educational outcomes. They tell us that when you are in proximity to black and brown bodies, your educational attainment lessens, right? And it calls us to ask a larger question, especially because I get hella mad when I see the terms, right? Diversity, tolerance. Let's call this what it's, because remember, y'all, if I'm tolerating something, what am I doing initially? I don't like it. So I tolerate it, yeah, okay, right? And then diversity, right? And UIC, and I always have to call out my employer on their infinite wisdom, right? So UIC had a committee on diversity and then tried not to use the language, tried not to use the word race. I said, look, y'all, what's happening here? You're talking about diversity, but yet you won't use race because you're fearful of a lawsuit in Chicago, in a school system that is 80% black and brown, no, 90% black and brown. How does this happen, right? What world are we in? So now, when we think about this in real time, that situation in Ogden and Jenner is a microcosm of Chicago. When we start to think about the distribution of goods and resources, economics, all we have to do is look at schools, housing, employment, and healthcare opportunities. And we see these vast disparities, but the question that we have not asked is whether or not this is purposeful. I cannot make this argument that it is happenstance. I will make the argument that it is engineered by state bodies. Now, I know that makes me extremely unpopular and extra uninvited. But at the same time, I always tell folks, when we look at data, the data is on our side. When we look at disinvestment in particular communities, you can see what resources have been taken out of particular schools. And you can see what resources have been taken out of schools historically. When we actually talk about an equitable system, now we have to think about the priority is for those who actually have the least. And that's a different equation. So equity is not about, and because all things being equal, we know in schools that schools are universes to themselves. Every school is different. Every young person is different. Schools will have different needs. So when we talk about equity, equity means people getting what they need when they need it. Because if we give everybody the same thing, those same things could be useless in a particular school. So now, when we look at those now 5 communities, those 5 zip codes that have been identified by the Chicago Police Department as being hotbeds for shootings and homicides, I don't even have to look at them to tell you what's happening there. A school that's been disinvested, housing insecurity, lack of employment, lack of access to health care. Now, at no fault of the residents of those communities, but as part and parcel and result of a set of policies that have determined their disposability. And this is something that I think we have to grapple with, and it's not just the times, because I'm not as concerned about Trump, because I saw that with Reagan, all the way down to the same campaign slogan, right? And I remember in the 80s in Chicago how it hit when social programs got scraped, right? When things that people would consider to be a safety net got hit. I remember when you started to see the first spaces where schools become disinvested. And I actually got checked by folks and saying, no, Stovall, not the 80s. You need to go back to the 50s when Chicago made a determination that it would not desegregate and would only allow existing white residents to make a decision to leave the schools, right? So it's not this decision around desegregating, but this decision around whether or not they would leave a school. They call the term a permissive transfer. So now, when we start to think about these processes, our history tells us another story. And I think here, when we talk about health outcomes and we talk about the access to a quality education, we also have to talk about institutional and political will. Because now you got a mayor in the beginning of his first term who said, I'm not going to spend money on a school system where 25% of the folks aren't going to do anything with their lives anyway. That's the mayor. Right? You also got a person who, and let's put it out there, and I think this becomes important. When you cover up a murder to win an election, something else is happening. You have deemed particular bodies disposable. And in that disposability, those decisions now ring heavy on the heads of folks who are going through this in the day-to-day, right? And we have to release ourselves from the common pathological white supremacist assumptions around communities of color in schools, right? And the first thing is saying no family member, no parent, no guardian wants a poor educational experience for the young folks in schools. Not a one. Now, the second piece is to say, what would it mean to look at those communities that have been historically disinvested and now engage in investment strategies towards making sure that they have access to an equitable and quality education? Now, there's a reason why we don't get particular access to quality education. As Dr. Murray put it forward, we know that one of the critical components of education is our capacity and ability to ask deeper questions so that we can move on changing the conditions in our particular communities. When you ask those questions are going to question the validity of systems. And systems aren't created to destroy themselves. Systems are created to maintain power. So now, what is the interruption? And do we dare to go so far to engage that interruption? Right? Or as what Fred Moten refers to as a fugitive space. Right? And we were educated, a lot of us were educated in fugitive space. Those teachers who were willing to get in trouble were committed to a fugitive space without ever having to say the word fugitive space. They can look at us in our face and say, look, I am not worried about this. I am much more worried about when you leave, will you come back tomorrow? And when you come back tomorrow with an understanding of what it is that we must do to determine what this place will look like and determine what you will do and what you will do for those who will come after you. Now, school systems aren't constructed to do that. School systems are constructed to chide you and punish you for engaging that, right? So we just see a report that comes out of New York City that talks about black girls are the most suspended and expelled group in the largest school system in the world, right? New York City has 1.1 million students, right? So every 1 in 350 people in the United States is a student in New York City public schools, if we think about it in that way, right? And in that space, they have committed themselves to engaging black girls in this way. And what is the number one infraction that they are suspended for? And think about it. Willful defiance. Now, if you work with young people, I do not know if you know a young person who has not been willfully defiant in their life. So now you've made a determination on their head around who will be targeted. So now I always think about a good friend of mine, Dylan Rodriguez, who challenges me. He says, look, man, we're not talking about a school to prison pipeline. In some communities, we're talking about a school and prison nexus. They are the same thing. Right? So if I'm walking through a space and I'm getting wanded down, I'm walking through a space that now I'm wearing blue and whites, I'm walking into a space where in the lunchroom there's a law, there's a policy that security can't stand more than 30 feet from each other and always have to be in each other's sight, there's another place that they do that. So now we have to ask the critical question. What is the interruption to this? When we talk about an equitable school system, we have to interrupt this, right? There's no choice around that. So now when we talk about mass incarceration, Dylan challenged me to say, no, we're talking about targeted incarceration, because the 13th Amendment says slavery is abolished except for punishment, right? So this thing around thinking about it in real time. And when we have young folks and we engage them critically, they're going to ask that question. If any of you all have kids or nieces and nephews, you are the most frustrated by what question? Why? Right? And to me, when we talk about an education system, the education system needs to be founded on why. But we have a schooling system that's founded on particular people's disposability. And that's the funkiest. And that's when things happen that we don't like. And that's why when I get into my 5th period social studies class that I teach with Yamli Rodriguez, I always have to ask that question. When they say, why we gotta do this? That is an excellent question. Why do we have to do this? Is it part of regular school, order and compliance? Or is it something else? And I appreciate Brother Troy LaRaviere, who's in the audience with us today, because he, in team teaching with him, he taught me a very valuable lesson about what it means to quote unquote be smart. Smart is a social construction. It's what people have said to you about being able to do certain things. Now, it hasn't asked you a question about your capacity to do anything. It's just said that because you've met these certain rules and requirements, that you're now considered smart. But I always think about my grandmother's wisdom. It says, look, don't come back from college being an educated fool. Right? Because it's more geared towards you becoming more benign to the things that affect you than to engage it. So now I truly appreciate folks from the public health community and the medical community, because they're folks like Kamara Jones with the Center for Disease Control, who's actually called out and provided a medical definition for racism. I was like, oh, right? And she talks about it as the effects of white supremacy on health outcomes. I'm like, oh, all right? And then the medical sciences, medical and public health community also have a medical definition for hope. A sense of control of one's destiny. So now the question becomes, can schools be that place? Because in many communities they are not. But that is not the fault of anyone who is in attendance in that space. We have to ask this larger systemic question. And when we ask that larger systemic question, those answers will propel us to now ask engage a very different set of work. And I challenge us here today because I'm also grappling with this, right? You wake up in the morning sometimes and say, damn, this is really happening, right? But you also have to say, all right, well, there's a group of young folks that I'm working with who have been determined on changing the human condition. Will I support or reject them? And I'm about the position of supporting them, right? In all my tragic mistakes. Like if you came to fifth period, you would see Stovall messing up. In fact, we shouldn't even call it fifth period. Just call it Stovall's mess ups. Right? Or when my students say, Stovall, you need to join the 20th century. It's like, look, man, if you write another thing on the board, I'm a choke. Right? So they nicknamed me low tech. Right? So because I got all these dry erase markers, and they're always like, Stovall, you so low tech, man. Like, get into it, and they like, get a PowerPoint, get a keynote, get something, man. Come on, Stovall. And then, but this thing around how are we willing, and this is another thing when we talk about equitable education, how are we willing as older folk to be educated on this current condition? Not as folks who know everything, but folks who are willing to ask a critical question and work with others to unearth what's actually happening. And I'll end on this. The city of Chicago has approached 6,000 shootings and now has breached 700 homicides. Now, I don't think about that as anything that has to do with young people and an ingrained propensity towards violence. I understand that as an engineered conflict of the state that is rooted in lack of access to quality education, housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of access to health care. We have created communities that have been deemed disposable. Their destruction is understood as normal, right, and good. What is the work that we will do to interrupt that narrative? So not the singular narrative, but the multiple narratives that exist. When we are talking about engaging in the lives of young folks, it will call for us to think about our work differently. I'm very appreciative of you all in public health, medicine, and medical sciences for beginning that conversation. It is unfortunate how far behind we are in education, right? I teach at a space that's probably more fearful of young folks than they are willing to engage them. So now, in that particular work, the question that I ask is, who do I do that work with? And I'm very thankful for folks asking these critical questions, because when we ask those critical questions, the answers are discernible and they are to be shared. And in too many instances, when we don't share those in community spaces, we run the risk of reifying what is currently happening. And education over school is an ideological and material space where we need to start. And I see folks across the country who have committed to this, but again, we also must come to the reality that it is an uphill struggle. There are more people who are not committed to this, who don't want this to happen. So now, in our willfulness, what will we do to not only push back, but to create? Last thing, and I think this is critically important, when we talk about education in schools, I think about education as the capacity of young people to think and create. We live in a city that is determined that some people will not be allowed to think and create. I am committed to interrupting that paradigm. I know it will be costly, but I am very thankful for folks like yourself who are willing to engage me as we walk that walk. Thank y'all again.
And what I would like you to consider is the things that Professor Stovall talked about. He really challenged us. What can we do? In this audience, we have people that have been educated at some level. You know, y'all have some tools, you can read. So are we really using those tools to get the education that allows us to create, think and create? I wanted to, you know, and let me ask you, was Brother Stovall woke? Yeah. I want to do a shout out. We have some Chicago Public School students here. Raise your hands if you're a CPS student. All right, welcome. I won't put you on the spot because we should be having one of y'all up here talking, telling us what the hell we're supposed to do. But anyway, so we're glad you're here with us today. Welcome. So, Professor Stovall laid out the situation that we're in and points out something that's important. There are lots of times when we have to have broad policy changes to affect deep structural conditions. But I think the critical lesson he talked about in terms of what's going on right up the street with Jenner and Ogden is that everywhere you look, every incident that you may think is just a blurb in the paper or a 30-second spot on the evening news is really an opportunity to understand what's really going on and what those underlying structures are. It also creates an opportunity for us to educate each other and to actually take action to begin to change those deep structural conditions. Our next speaker is one of my favorite folks. So I'm gonna tell you all, I'm gonna give you all a secret if you haven't heard Ralph Mateer before. He's gonna give you a lot of information. It's gonna make a lot of sense. And when you leave, you'll have trouble remembering how to explain it to somebody else. So I'm gonna make a suggestion. So we're gonna put, well, first of all, his website has lots of slides on it. I think we're going to be able to put this up, where's Wesley, on our website. Is that right? Yes, okay. So don't worry about taking notes. This is something for CPS. Don't worry about taking notes. Just sit there and listen and follow what he's talking about so that you can understand how we got in this mess and how relatively easy it is to get out of this mess if we had the political power and will to do so. Ralph is the executive director for the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. It's a bipartisan, remember that, a bipartisan organization, a bipartisan think tank that's committed to federal, state, and local workforce education, physical and economic budget policies, trying to make sure that what we elect our elected officials to do, they actually do. You can see Ralph on the evening news frequently. He was appointed as a full voting commissioner to the congressionally established Equity and Excellence in Education Commission. He is knowledgeable on many, many aspects of government, but he really is passionate and devoted to the issue of equity in education. So I want to bring to the podium Brother Ralph Mateer.
All right, so first of all, folks, you just had Professor Stovall up here, right? An engaged, activist, young, full of energy. I'm a white, old, former corporate lawyer. So you're going to get what you're going to get in contrast, right? So just be ready for that. I am working my way to full-blown curmudgeon. Second, you mentioned that my organization's bipartisan, and that's true. What does that really mean? It means my board of directors has Republicans and Democrats on it who neither like nor trust each other very much, and that's great for the staff. Because all we do is focus on best practices and data. I frankly don't give a rip if an idea happens to be liberal or conservative or somewhere in the middle. Let's look at what the best practices are for providing that service. Let's look at what it costs, and let's go do it, period. Liberal, conservative, doesn't really matter, shouldn't enter the equation. So today we're talking about education and problems in education. And I'm going to tell you, like virtually every problem you see associated with the public sector, it's not a big mystery. It has one very simple starting place: tax policy. Because let me explain one thing to you that's true no matter where you are in this country. Where needs are greatest, resources are least. So you got to find a way to raise tax revenue from areas that have wealth and invest it in services to create access to opportunity in communities that have needs. That means that by definition, tax policy has to be redistributive to work, which makes it politically controversial. So the second that is the core thing behind what finances every public service is so controversial politically, it is hard to get it done rationally, which is why things like charged rhetoric and bomb doesn't work here. Because if you're going to change tax policy and adequately fund the public sector so it can make those investments that we need to create social and economic justice, guess what? You need a broad ideological spectrum of politicians voting for the change. You're not going to get there by railing against evil corporate America. You're not going to get there. You're not going to vote your way. What you have to do is appeal to folks' innate sense of fairness. Because everyone talks about common values, all this other stuff. That's an interesting conversation to have. Have you met one person who doesn't think that they are fair-minded? Ever met one? Oh yeah, I'm a biased idiot. No, right? Everybody thinks they're fair. So what you have to do is make a compelling case based on the data that appeals to fairness, whether someone is liberal or conservative or somewhere in the middle. So what's our starting point in the great state of Illinois? Why don't we fund education well? And the answer is really very simple. The state doesn't put adequate resources into education. And that has pushed the primary responsibility for funding schools down to local property taxes. What that has done, it has tied the quality of public education a child receives to the property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. It's that simple. Why? Why has Illinois failed to fund schools adequately from state-based resources? Answer simple. It has, as this picture shows, a structural deficit. What's that mean? It's real simple stuff. It means your current policy on taxes, how you raise revenue, is insufficient to fund your current level of services and pay your current debt into the future. So every year you're going to have slightly less revenue than what you will need to maintain the prior year's level of services, a structural imbalance. Now here's a picture of the structural deficit in Illinois. And I'm going to admit one thing. This is the one and only piece of modeling in my entire presentation. We don't do modeling. Why? Because your assumptions could jury-rig your outcomes, right? What we like to do at CTBA is math. Very simple math, publicly available data sets. Okay? It's the way to do it. But to project forward, you have to have a model. So you should know this was peer-reviewed by 4 different independent PhD economists, as well as the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C. It's real simple. We only adjust for historic rates of inflation and population change, and we assume a normal economy. We assume no changes in law. Those are the exact same assumptions, for instance, that the Congressional Budget Office uses when it makes projections. This starts in 2015 and pretends the state had a balanced budget that year. Its revenue were equal to its expenditures. It did not, by the way. It had an accumulated deficit of $5.97 billion. But what we're really trying to do is see if our current revenue, if it was actually supporting current services, was enough to keep forward. The green bar is the cost of maintaining current services the state spends its money on into the future, just adjusting for inflation and population growth. And it's the cost of repaying the debt the state has already borrowed. That you don't adjust for anything. You know what the debt payments are. The red line is our current law on tax policy, adjusted the same way. First thing you notice is a dip, right? You see that big dip? The state had a temporary tax increase that passed in 2011 that is being phased down. Well, when you phase down a tax increase, you lose revenue, and that is the revenue we are losing. So what you could see is our revenue will not maintain our current level of expenditures, period, into the future. So why does this matter? Well, obviously, if you don't have the resources, you're going to cut spending on services. And in Illinois, we should be really concerned about what that means for public education. Because of all 50 states, Illinois ranks 50th in the country in the portion of education paid for by state tax revenue. We are dead last. And we can't afford to be dead last. That's what the data say on tax policy. So how does the state spend its money? This is the next thing that people that really are concerned about investing in our future have to understand. Well, our general fund budget, and this is the 2015 budget, and the reason for that is pretty simple, right? It's the last year our state actually had a budget. I know, it's amazing. And you see, we spent roughly $35 billion that year, and I broke it into two categories. If you look at those first three line items under Roman numeral 1 up there, or part 1, those are hard costs. There's no discretion. The state has to pay those things by law. And there's three items there, right? You see debt service to third parties like banks and bondholders. The pension payment is now the subject of a continuing appropriation, meaning every single year they have to put the money in unless they change the law. And then other statutory transfers, and there's really only two big ones there. There's something called the Local Government Distributive Fund, where the state shares its income tax revenue with local governments. And there's some Medicaid transfers we have to make by law. If you think about it, Medicaid is a joint federal-state program, right? So we have to put this money into trust funds, and then the feds put their money in, and we pay for things. So you take that off the top, and that's $11 billion that gets spent with no one voting on anything. $24 billion then gets spent in a somewhat discretionary manner. This is what legislators vote on. Where do 9 out of $10 that we spend go? Education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. 9 out of 10 bucks. So who has heard an elected official say something like, hey, we ought to solve our fiscal problems at the state level with across-the-board cuts? Anybody heard that? Across-the-board cuts? You know why they say that? They don't want you to know what the board is. Because the board is education, health, social services, and public safety. That's what they got to cut. And they don't want you to know what the board is because they're politicians and they read polls. And the polls tell them that every one of those public services individually is supported strongly, so much so that over 65% of our state consistently doesn't want any cut in any of those four areas. You know what else the polling data consistently says? Over half of our state, 58%, says, hey, solve your budget problems with spending cuts, not increase taxes. This is why data matter. We got to get folk to understand government isn't some amorphous blob that exists to suck up their tax dollars and not make investments they care about. And in particular, state government makes investments in the very core services we all demand and expect, and frankly, contribute to social and economic justice. All right, so then we had our first budget year, 2016, with no full budget for the state. Yet the state still spent money via court order, consent decree. They did pass limited budgets for things like K-12 education, et cetera. This looks kind of busy. Let's jump down to the bottom line. See net appropriations, that's spending on current services. 2015, it was $24 billion and change. 2016, the maximum they will spend, and they won't spend quite that much, is $21 billion. That's almost a $3 billion cut on education, health, social services year to year. That's the effect of having no budget. And what's really interesting about that, it's going to end up being social services and healthcare that'll bear the brunt of these cuts, without any elected official having to go on record as voting for the cut, without the governor vetoing the spending or saying, I want that service cut. So, complete lack of transparency and a complete disinvestment. Now, I told you that, and I showed you on the prior slide that the accumulated deficit last year, 2015, was $5.97 billion. So maybe there's a fiscal conservative or two here in the audience that says, well, maybe it's a bad thing we're not investing adequately in core services, but hey, at least with that cut in spending, we're going to improve our fiscal condition, right? Wrong. So this is how things work. Because of that decline in tax revenue we're going to see in 2016 from the phase down of the temporary tax increase, we're only going to have $30.3 billion in revenue. If you go to the first line up here, that's here, $30.3 billion in revenue for 2016 services. That's $6 billion less, by the way, than we had last year. And then there's those hard costs. Remember those things we have to pay by law, those three items? Well, those go up 2016 from 20 to $12.7 billion, right? So you take that $12 billion off the top, that's money they have to spend, that leaves you with $18 billion. Okay, that's the revenue you have. Also by law, you have to pay those past due bills that have made up your deficit spending from the prior fiscal year before the end of the next one. That's $5.97 billion. Take that off of your revenue. So now you're left with $12.3 billion in revenue, and even after making all those cuts, you're still spending $21 billion on services, meaning your deficit jumped from $5.9 to $9.4 billion after cutting services by nearly $3 billion. If you don't have adequate resources on the front end, you will not get positive outcomes on the back end. Our fiscal problems are driven by bad tax policy, and that means, in particular, if you look at the data, our education policy and problems are driven by bad tax policy. If we don't raise taxes and raise them the right way at the front end, I don't care what you guys organize about on the back end for this, that, or the third thing, you're not getting it because they can't afford it, period. Here's our actual track record on spending in the state general fund budget. And this is in nominal dollars. And this is on those four core services from 2009 forward. You see any bump up in spending? No. We've been cutting. This doesn't even adjust for inflation. This is just the state's own numbers, what they actually spent on those four core services. There's a lot of rhetoric out there that the state's just wasted that temporary tax increase and the revenue from that temporary tax increase on new and expanded spending. Well, it doesn't match the data. And what I'm trying to impress on you is, guys, focus on the budget. Focus on the revenue. It drives everything. So politicians are able to get away with bald-faced lies about what's happening with our fiscal condition because they trust you won't look at the numbers. I'm trying to make you want to look at the numbers. So no, there's been no ramp up in spending on services. We're spending less. But those hard costs have gone up. Remember, there's three. Debt service to third parties like banks. And here it's that blue bar. You can see there was none of that in 2004. They incurred some debt, that little blue bar, $1.2 billion in paybacks in 2010, and that's grown to $2.2 billion over time. The reddy, orangey, ugly color in the middle, that's those statutory transfers out for those two big things, Medicaid expenses and sharing income tax revenue with local governments. And really over a 12, 14-year period here, didn't grow by much, grew by $1 billion. And if you adjust for inflation in real terms, it actually declined. What's that gray bar? That's the pension payment. Now, why this is important. It gets completely mischaracterized by the media and politicians. So I'm going to be clear what this is all about. It's not about pensions. It's about debt. Because over this whole period, the actual cost of funding our pensions, it's something called normal cost, but it's what you got to invest in to pay all these promised benefits, et cetera, varied depending on the year anywhere from 1.2 to 1.6 billion. Look at the payment we had to make in 2016, 6.8 billion. 1.6 was the actual cost of benefits that year. 5.2 billion was paying the pension systems back for what the state borrowed from them over the prior 40 years to hide the fact it had that structural deficit. Because politicians didn't want to raise taxes to fund services. So what did they do? Well, they cut services a little, but you can't keep cutting those things a lot because they're very popular politically. Brilliant. Let's find an irresponsible way to borrow against what we owe the pension systems and use that borrowed money to cover up that gap between our revenue and our service costs and leave the payback of that for future generations. Welcome to the future, right? This is a payment plan that we're getting killed by today that was passed in 1995. Look how it ramps up. Now, I happen to think I'm pretty good with tax policy. I can't design a tax system that grows like that has chunks and chunks of revenue every year coming in at that rate, right? And then have enough additional revenue growth to maintain services after inflation and pay your other debt. That's what's killing us. And I want to have you see the whole ramp. This is what it looks like over time. In out years, it's over $16 billion a year in a payment. Are you kidding me? When they passed this law in 1995, they knew we could never fund it. And I say that because for the first 15 years of this repayment schedule they passed, they by law continued the practice of borrowing against the pensions. They grew the unfunded liability. In 1995, when they passed the law, our total unfunded liability at the state level for pensions was $17 billion. They grew it to over $83 billion by law. Now here's what they did. This is the state's own numbers, by this. Nothing that we at the center made up. These are the state's own numbers. These are the factors that have contributed to the growth in that unfunded liability over time from the passage of that law through 2013. It'd be even worse if I updated the data, but I didn't because I get depressed too, right? And you can only drink so much. All right. The blue bars, those are the items inherent to the pension system that have actually increased our unfunded liability since 1995. You can see it's only 7% of the growth in the unfunded liability. It's next to nothing. Salary increases are actually negative. Then there's benefit increases, there's changes in actuarial assumptions, and there's other factors that impact the pension systems, like frankly, those public sector workers keep living a lot longer than we really want them to. So those all added costs. Then there's that green bar. What's that? We lost $17 billion in what we had put in our pension systems during the Great Recession. Well, everybody lost during the Great Recession. If our only problems were what's inherent to the design of the pension system itself and the Great Recession, our systems today would be about 62% funded. You're healthy at 80%. In 30 years, you could get there no problem. Nice, easy rate. The red bar, that's the additional principal borrowed against what was owed the pensions over this sequence by law. That's what we're paying back, and that's what's killing us. Now, we did have a tax cut, and I love it. And by the way, the tax cut, the phase down of the temporary tax increase, happened on the Democrats' watch. They controlled the governor's office and both chambers of the General Assembly. So, I mean, I'm happy to throw shade at both parties because they both, frankly, deserve it. All right. When that was allowed to phase down, there were a number of reasons given by Democrats for letting it happen. The key ones were, well, we have a new governor coming in, he's a Republican, and He wants us to hold off, so in deference to the new government will hold. I can't evaluate that from a data standpoint. It's some political decision, whether that's wise or not. Maybe in retrospect, not looking so wise, but whatever. Not a data-based analysis. But they did say two things that we could analyze. Number one, well, at least when the taxes start phasing down, that'll create an economic benefit for both low-income and middle-income families as they get some tax relief, and it'll help stimulate our economy. I could test that. So this was actually peer-reviewed by the Illinois Department of Revenue. And if you look at these numbers, and we love at the center charts like this with just numbers everywhere. This is your net Illinois taxable income. Notice that they only got 13% of the dollar value of this tax relief. Then go to the far left. They happen to be 60% of our taxpayers. So the bottom 60% of our taxpayers only got 13% of the tax relief. This didn't help low and middle income families. It missed low and middle income families. Who did it help? Over half, 54% of the tax relief, went to the wealthiest 11%. Did I want to break it down to wealthiest 10%? Yes. The Illinois Department of Revenue couldn't sort their data that finely. 11 was closest they could get, so you got 11. There you go. Better yet, most of this tax relief went to millionaires. So if you had $1 million a year or more in taxable income, your average annual tax break, so what you got on average per year, let me get this number right, $36,790. That's your average tax break for millionaires, which is more than the taxable income of everyone in the bottom 60%. So no. This did not help low and middle income families. It won't help our economy. Why? Well, guess what? The way you stimulate the economy is only by giving tax relief to low and middle income families. You know why? They spend it. They don't do that goofy thing called saving. They don't save because they can't. If you look at the national data, since 1980, actually 90% of our country, the bottom 90% is earning less today than they did in 1980 after inflation. And our economy is consumer spending. It's 68 to 70% consumer spending. So tax relief that goes to people who are losing income on an inflation-adjusted basis gets spent, and that creates jobs. People at the top have rapidly growing incomes after inflation. They're not going to spend it. They're going to save it, maybe create a trust fund for junior, whatever. But it's not going to stimulate the economy. Even worse, we're actually going to hurt the economy. Why? We're paying for this tax cut, which goes to the wealthy, by cutting services. What are our services now? 9 out of $10 go to education, health, social services, and public safety. So when you cut spending in those 4 categories, what you're really cutting is the wages of the teachers and the social workers and the healthcare providers and the correctional officers online providing the service. That's most spending. Public services are labor intensive. So great, you're cutting the salary of people who are good spenders because they're middle income to put money in the pocket of people who are poor spenders because they got all the money they need. That literally takes spending out of your private sector economy and results in job loss. One more kicker for this. Where do you think services are being cut? Winnetka? Barrington? No. Harvey, Dalton, East Chicago, East St. Louis, Marion, right? So the great news for low and middle income families brought to them by Democrats was they're going to pay for this tax relief that they don't get, goes to rich folks, in the form of losing services in their home communities. This is triple bad policy if you are low or middle income. And it's the law of the land in Illinois. So how do we solve our problems? Well, number one, this is just, that pension ramp, this is that red line. That's just another way to show the pension ramp. Throw it out, refinance the debt on a level dollar basis. Simple, right? Saves billions. If you want to fund that pension ramp, you have to cut your expenditures on current services by 46%. So let's not do that. 2, raise taxes. There's 3 ways to do it. We got to tax some retirement income. I hope there's some potential because I'm always the least popular guy in any room I'm on. So any retirees here, yeah, we should tax some retirement income. 41 states in America have an income tax. We're one of only 3 that taxes no retirement income at all. You could do it in a way that's not regressive, and we have suggested that. So if someone has $50,000 a year or less in adjusted gross income, they'd keep the full exemption, pay no state income tax on their retirement income, and then phase out the exemption over time so that someone wouldn't pay the state's income tax, which is at a very low rate, by the way, on all their retirement income until they had $150,000 a year or more in income. You could afford it, okay? 2, expand that sales tax base in the state of Illinois. The base of a tax is just what it applies to. 45 states in America have a sales tax. Of those 45, we have the most narrow base. That means we tax less of the modern economy than any other state with a sales tax. Why? Our sales tax pretty much only applies to the sale of goods, hard physical things you could touch. This podium, my tie, whatever, things you could touch. We don't tax services. Today in Illinois, only 17% of our economy, i.e. what we tax, is the sale of goods. Over 72% is the sale of services. You don't need to be a fiscal policy expert to understand you cannot leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect to have revenue that'll fund services over time. Not taxing enough of the economy. So you got to tax it. Will that make us Taxachusetts? No. Like I said, every other state taxes services more than us. And even in the Midwest, all of our neighboring states tax services more than us. Iowa and Governor Walker's Wisconsin tax every service we think you should tax. Have you seen busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming here to get their hair cut? Because they tax it there, we don't here. Have you seen their haircuts? They should come, should they? Silly looking people. But they are not coming for tax reasons. It's just a myth. And then there's our income tax rate. Would I like to have a graduated structure like they do at the federal level with higher rates of income on high? Yeah. We have a state constitution that prohibits that. Got to have one flat rate. So we got to bump it up. And we got to generate in total, by this mix of tax increases, somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 billion a year to get rid of that structural deficit and actually fund education to the point where any child in any community could walk into her or his neighborhood school and receive the type of education that child needs to succeed academically. I think that's what we ought to go do. Now, $7 to $8 billion was a lot when I was a kid back in the Paleozoic era, but it's not that much in the context of the state's economy. Illinois has a $745 billion state economy. You're talking just about 1%. A tax increase that takes only about 1% of your state's economy is so small in context, it cannot be measured by any peer-reviewed econometric model to determine whether or not it can damage your economy. It is too small. So, we are allowing our state to have the single most inequitable education funding system in America because we refuse to pass a tax increase that is too small to be measured. Now, I know this isn't how it's portrayed in the media, and politicians are hopeful you won't open your eyes and do the math. And I say, if you really want to change things, you really want to get to an equitable system of education funding, you really want a state government that can invest in core services and create social and economic justice, organize on tax policy. It is absolutely job one. Thank you for listening.
time for our table discussions. I'm going to ask Ralph and David to come up this way so we can take a few questions for our speakers. This is a rover mic? Okay, so I'll let somebody roll with that. Any questions for our speakers? Yes. Welcome, by the way. Ralph?
Yo.
I'm trying to talk about the pension.
Maybe if people could say their name and if there was.
My name is Troy LaRaviere. I'm with the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association. When I talk, I've tried to talk about that pension doublespeak to people, and I often use the metaphor of, it's probably a little crass, but I'll often use the metaphor of a husband buying a fur coat, spending his mortgage money or borrowing from his mortgage money to buy a fur coat for his mistress, and then claiming that the wife has to work an extra job in order to pay for the mortgage because they owe more now. And I say, what is the wife working extra time for, to pay the mortgage or to pay for the fur coat? That there's this thing that the money was misspent on, and to have that actual thing that the money was misspent on seems to help people to understand it. And so if we were to take that at the state level, is there a thing or a series of things that we can look at in terms of waste and misspending that we can say that that pension money was borrowed to cover this? What would that this be that we could point people to?
For you. Education, health, social services, and public safety. Because that's where 9 out of $10 got spent. So they didn't have enough money to fund those things with tax revenue. So they borrowed what they owed the pension and subsidized service delivery cost for generations. So the way I try to talk about it when I'm dealing with taxpayers that got to pay more now to bail us out is, frankly, we've had a sweetheart deal in Illinois for generations as taxpayers. We haven't paid the full dollar value of these services we've consumed. Just haven't paid for it. The pensions have subsidized it. So we borrowed against the pensions to cover these services for years, and now we're paying them back. So if it were a bank we borrowed from, nobody in Springfield would be talking about a way to get out of paying the bank back. No one. We shouldn't be talking about a way out of paying the pensions back. What we should be talking about is finding a way to raise adequate revenue so we don't have to borrow anymore against the pension systems, and we don't create this kind of goofy debt structure. So sadly, well, that's a great metaphor, and I'm going to find a way to steal parts of that, but I don't think it actually is helpful straight on point here.
Could the fur coat be the fact that we have not paid?
You love that fur coat.
Could that thing be not the education and social services, but the tax break we've been given?
Yeah, it's the artificially low taxes that we've decided to have. Yeah.
Brother, I don't know why you want the state to have a mistress. I'm confused. Question here in the front.
Hi, I guess I'll share exactly who I am. I'm Letisa Wallace. I'm a state representative.
All right.
I came in when
I wish I had known that because I would have had you take notes.
trust me, I came in when all this was happening. The lame duck session in which those decisions were not made to keep the 5% income tax, those were my first weeks in Springfield. And I was anxious to go ahead and take that vote, but it was not. It didn't look good politically. Yeah, nobody put it on the board. If they'd put it on the board, I would have taken it. But my question is, how do we, because there's a person who is really winning the media battle in terms of tax policy, and this person is also benefiting the most personally. His friends are also benefiting from driving down our bonds, buying up more bonds at a rate that's less than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago. And we still are trying to figure out how to equitably fund education, how to equitably fund human services, all the things you listed, public safety, education, higher education as well. When you mention organizing around tax policy, can you give some insights as to what that would look like? Because people memes that are shared on social media. And people like a quick little 30-second video, and they don't want to know that this is, this is the way out. And I need a way to be able to explain it, because I'm there, I'm ready to take the hard vote, but the public has to understand why it happened.
First of all, Daniel Hertz, wave your hand from my organization. So Daniel actually might be able to figure out a meme or something. I am so old. It's lucky I know what a meme is, which I do, but and here's really the problem with these core issues, right? And you're learning that, and she's not part of the problem. So I really should have limited my comments to the leadership in the Democratic Party because they've been problematic. But there's been a lot, and it's not just her that's been good. I could name Representative Will Davis, Senator Toy Hutchinson, Senator Kim Lightford, Representative Al Riley. There's been a number of state reps, state senators that have gone on record as trying to do the right thing. The problem with solving these core issues is there's no magic silver bullet. You're talking about systems change. So there are a number of things that need to be ticked off to get to that systems change, and that doesn't align itself well with the soundbite or with the quick infomercial. But Daniel's better at that stuff than I am, so he could probably be helpful. But it's really important in this discussion to get some of those conservative downstate Democrats who are in Alabama, right? And have you ever been downstate? Okay. We need some of them, as well as some of the moderate Republicans from the collars. And you're not going to get them with the charged rhetoric. So that's why I went back to sort of the initial framing. Look, you want to solve our problems, you want to pay our bills, you want to invest adequately in schools, you want to create a good economy. Here's what taxes need to be. And it won't harm our economy. I had slides on that too. And here's an interesting factoid. There is no statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and economic growth at the state level, period. None. So, what really matters with tax policy is getting it right so you can invest in core services. But you want to know what does drive the economy that are decision makers' purview in Springfield? Two things: infrastructure and education. So those states that have done the best job of investing in education over the last 30 years have a statistically meaningful advantage over all other states in median income growth, GDP growth per capita, and overall GDP growth. I mean, every core measurement of the economy. So if you really want to talk to business people and folks that are moderately conservative or whatever and get them to support tax increases, you got to tie it to the economy, and you got to find a way to resonate with them and appeal to something they value, and in this case, economic growth. And it really is a compelling case. We have a research product available on our line, I think, called the Value Proposition Associated with Investing in Education, and it really shows the multipliers you get, dollar in versus benefit out. And it's not just economic benefit, by the way. What you will find is reduced correctional costs, reduced healthcare costs, reduce social problem costs. So you save taxpayers money as well if you do a better job educating children on the front end. And there's some power to eliminating things like achievement gaps, white, black, rich, poor. We looked at the economic data and discovered that I think eliminating the achievement gap between white and black kids nationally would mean trillions of dollars to the economy. And in Illinois, I think the bump would be something like $400 or $500 million a year more economic activity, a year, if we were just able to do these kinds of things. So net, there's value in making this investment in people. And I think that those are the kinds of things that bridge rather than reinforce ideological divides and allow you to get people to the table. So I don't know where you're going to get with Governor Rauner. I mean, he has made it his core mission to wipe Speaker Madigan off the face of the earth, and the Speaker, believe it or not, hasn't taken kindly to this. So they're in a special place. But I think you could find rank and file Republicans that would agree with a lot of this stuff, and maybe that's where you have to build the bridges.
And there's
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
just a quick example. The state of Minnesota actually has done something with this, right? And what they did, they actually captured the messaging, right? So Grassroots Action Illinois kind of put this forward in terms of looking at what this, because the state of Minnesota, for folks who are unaware, also has a billionaire governor, right? But this governor actually shifted and said, what would it mean to support folks in the state, right? And they had a very different conversation around, so everything in his campaign strategy was literally kind of putting up what Ralph put forward to us today and say, look, this is what's happening here. So now, and don't trust my own conjecture, look at this for yourself. So if you look at this, now we can make decisions around supporting these infrastructure costs. So I think the state of Minnesota, and I know state governments don't like to look at other state governments for examples, but at the same time, I think the ways in which they messaged how they would actually engage their expenditures was really important in terms of what they actually did, right? Because they're one of the states that have been able to stay in the black while funding infrastructure. So I think that's a really important piece in terms of how they set that up.
Yes, they raise taxes. I want to make sure we get to our tables. So I'm going to take one more question. I saw a brother over there.
And this is for Dr. David Stovall. I'm trying to wrap my mind around the statistics that you gave about 120 schools not having libraries. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out something that's so central to educating our students. How is it possible that, and I was having a conversation, what's your name?
Liz.
I was having a conversation with Liz about this. How is it possible that parents and principals and administrators and aldermen, how is it that they are not concerned with this issue? I think too often we try to attack the elephant, and it's that very small thing that we don't go after. So how is it possible that a principal could head up a school and not have a library?
Right. Yeah, I mean, this becomes the larger question. I mean, and I think we see examples like in Detroit. So folks may remember last year in Detroit where there was mold in schools. And it actually took a couple of principals to say, look, I will not have my babies in this building ingesting mold, right? And just literally saying, but it takes that type of push, because another thing, and I think this is the unfortunate part of justice work, you will see people who are much more engaged around protecting a check than actually engaged in those particular spaces. And Troy actually does this work, when there are that collection of principals that do speak up, the hammer comes towards them, right? And it comes from them in a very particular way. And they can do the hammer in a number of ways. And I think a lot of folks exist in fear of that hammer. So one of the ways that a hammer works is a very slow death, right? They'll just start slowly disinvesting in you, right? And then they'll use some trumped up charge that you didn't come to a meeting that you were never invited to, right? So this thing around, so these particular strategies. The other one is just the hammer, right? Where they say your school they use these crazy metrics and says your school has been underperforming and is under-enrolled. Based on the underperformance and under-enrollment, we're now going to close you, right? So this thing around how folks are caught in between those spaces, because I don't want us to leave with the message that there aren't principals who don't speak out against this, right? There are principals who actually go hard around this, but they get silenced in this larger construction. And then a last piece, and I think this becomes important. When you had a boom in the school population, in some school populations, a lot of times libraries got sacrificed for lunchrooms, right? So in terms of like schools were built in particular ways. So you see this in school construction in Chicago between the mid-60s and mid-70s, right? So some schools were actually not built with library spaces. right? So this thing around that combination, again, I think the multiple narrative kind of teases these things out, but I think we have to pay attention to the politics of fear and how communities are often positioned and silenced when they make these things known to the public, because that was something that we just got as a data point maybe about 7 years ago that folks have been knowing for quite some time. So this thing around really paying attention to that, because it's not so much a moral question, but we have all these structural issues that deeply impact how we get what's happening on the ground.
And I assume, Brother Troy, you want to add to this answer, so I'm going to let you add to this answer.
So want to add to this answer. Because listen closely to the brother's question. He said a lot, but in the end he said, how is it that a principal can have a school without a library? He put it on the principal. And there has been an organized campaign and messaging put to make sure that that is the question. Because it's not the question. The question is far different. CPS, a few years ago in 2013, started a new budgeting system that would ensure that that would be the question. Not how is it that the CEO or the mayor, but how is it that the principal? They started a new budget system. They call it student-based budgeting. We call it sabotage-based budgeting or sacrifice-based budgeting, because it forces the principal to sacrifice. And so it used to pay for positions in CPS. They would look at the number of kids you had and say, oh, you need this many positions. And you could go and hire whoever you wanted into that position. Now, instead of giving you a position, they give you a certain pool of money, and you have to stretch it as far as you can. And every year that pool of money gets lower and lower and lower. And so you as a principal have to begin to decide, what can we do without? Can we do without the sports program or our science program? What I have to sacrifice one. Do we go up in class size? I got 100 first graders. Now I can put them in 25 apiece in 4 classrooms, or I can put 33, and 34 in 3 classrooms. I've increased class size, but now there's a teacher's salary I don't have to pay anymore. I have to make a decision because I don't have money for both. Am I making sense here? And in many cases, it comes down to a principal saying, I have to, either I go up in class size to 40 kids or I lose my library. And many principals have decided I can't have 40 kids in the classroom, so I can't have a library. And so he's made the decision, but there's something that happened before he made the decision. It's like if someone holds your son and your daughter over a cliff and says, save one. And you reach out for the nearest one, your daughter. And he drops your son, and you look at the man and said, how could you sacrifice your son that way? That's not the question. You need to look at the one that held the 2 children up in the first place. How could you have forced him to make that kind of decision? Am I making sense here? But it's been planned for us to look at the principal who's being forced to make the decision instead of the people who are putting them in the position to have to make the decision in the first place. That's who we need to look at.
We're going to engage in some discussions at these tables. Each table has a facilitator. I assume the facilitators know what table they're supposed to be at. Is that correct? If you don't, facilitators, come see me. I have the list. And the question that you need to consider is exactly what Brother Troy ended up with. Where is the real problem? Who's pulling wool over whose eyes? What do we have to do? My question is, how can we allow a school to exist without a library? And let me tell you another secret. There's some schools that have libraries that the kids can't go into because there's not a librarian, okay? So books that don't get pulled off the shelf and opened up don't do anybody any good, okay? So as we come together, let us have a discussion about things we can be doing to correct this emergency. All these issues are connected. Why is it that 25, 30 years ago, 40% of the teachers were black in Chicago, and today it's less than 20%? What does that mean? Does that sound like maybe some people that were being disruptive and not following the agenda might have gotten moved out the way? So what are we going to do? What are we going to do to correct this problem? Because the same people that are holding those kids over the cliff are the same people that are trying to raise up your pension, take away your pension money. They're the same people that aren't repairing the potholes in the street. They're the same people that are sending our sons and daughters off to war. It's the same shit. So let me just end by saying, go to your tables and stay woke.